Within your comments, I get from time to time questions that really don't require a full quick tip, but when I put together a number of your questions, I'll have a quick tip. And so that's what this one is. It's a combination of things that you ask about or you've commented about in the comment sections of various quick tips you've watched. So one of those that is repeatedly asked is about, do you need to use medium when you start a painting? How do you put the paint on thin enough without using medium? How do you layer paint without one color mixing to another? And that sort of thing. And also, how do you control the lines of the brush? How can you make thin lines? There are 3 essential brush strokes. This is a technical thing. 3 essential brush strokes that every painter should know how to do. I've got them listed right here so that you can make a verbal note of them as I'm working. The first one has to do with alla prima layers. When you're painting alla prima means completing a painting in one session. That means if you're working with oil, that the first layer is going to still be wet when you put a second layer on, or even a third layer. So how can you do that without the paint mixing from that top layer to the layer underneath? Alright, so here's the way. You do not need to thin the paint with medium in order to make this work. So I'm going to show you how you can do that and have control of the mixing of the paint. So, and you can do that with any brush. Now, we couldn't take every brush I have and show you. I'm going to show you with this brush. This is a flat brush. This is my little Rosemary 274. And so this is a flat brush, but you can try this with all kinds of brushes, with your bristle brushes, flats, with your bristle brushes, oval, or other brushes you might have. And then find the brush that works the best for doing this, and because it is the way you move the brush and the way you pick up the paint that counts, it causes the results here, not necessarily the brush itself, although that does play a role. So here we go, building the alla prima layers. Now suppose you start, you've got a shadow layer, and you start with a darker color. When you pick up that color, for one thing, I've shown you this in another quick tip. For one thing, pick up the paint at the edge of the color so you can control the amount of paint that goes on. If you need to come to another section of your canvas to even the paint out on the brush, that's a good idea too. Now, if you have the paint loaded in the brush so that it's not piled up, you see, not piled up on the brush like this, but covers the brush, then if you then stroke it like this, and stroke it several times if you need to, like this, you get just a little bit more paint. I sort of been showing you that kind of overdid, so I need a little bit more, but it needs to be flattened like that, flattened on the brush so that you don't have a real thick layer. I've not found a way to say a thin layer without it sounding like I'm adding medium to it. But without medium, create a thin layer of paint. Without medium, you can do that by stroking it several times. If your canvas happens to be very, very textured, you'll have to stroke it more. The smoother the canvas surface is, the fewer times you have to stroke it. Also, if you have the canvas surface slightly, very slightly dampened with a mixture of poppy oil I use and Gamsol, or it could be linseed oil and Gamsol, but it should be very slightly dampened, not so that it wets your finger when you pull it across the surface. All of those things are technical. They enable better painting. Alright, so, and you might even experiment with how much paint can you load onto the brush. You see that's a little bit thicker. Can you see that? Just a little bit thicker, but it's still, I'll pull it here to pull it smooth on the brush, and let's see what that is. And also, that when you stroke, you don't stroke this way, but you stroke this way so that the paint glides onto the surface of the canvas in stroking back and forth in kind of a crisscross motion, then you can apply a very relatively thin layer of paint and still not have any canvas showing through. Now I will show you what I mean by how you're holding the brush. If this is the canvas like this, this is what we don't want to do, and this is what a lot of people do. They'll do their entire painting by painting on the tip of the brush. But you have the option of tip and belly. And if you will use the tip, let me just do this like this so that you can see. If you will push the tilt down and get a very slight bend on the brush and then pull it, then you have a better chance of the paint gliding onto the canvas rather than sliding and leaving bare canvas. So if you practice that little technique, that works very well. Now, so that's the bottom layer. Suppose then within that layer you want to raise some of this value just a little bit. In that case, you go to the next value up. And in this case, I've got a value line here, so I'll go to my next value up here, and I'm going to pull the same amount of paint onto the brush. Can you see that? I don't have it all piled up. But I do have the belly of the brush covered very well. You may have to practice a bit in order to find just how much you need. If you need to even it on the brush, you just pull it against the canvas palette to even it up. Let me just get just a little bit more of that now. Now, watch how this will glide over the surface, just like that. One stroke, and holding the brush, again, holding the brush more at an angle and a little bit more parallel, like that. The paint will go on without mixing in. I'll do that again. I'll go up and pull just a little bit different color, or get the color just a little bit lighter. And again, you see, not piled up on the brush, glide it onto the surface, and it sits on top. Now, if you want to mix it, well, then you change the tilt of the brush like this. The more parallel, or perpendicular rather, you have the brush to the canvas, the more mixing is going to happen. You can use the tip to mix. There's several angles of the brush on the canvas that will allow that mixing to happen. You find that, and if you want to mix it, then you can just pull the brush through and allow that color to mix. And you can use the corner like I'm using here and allow that color to mix in. But if you want it to sit on top, then you do that. Now, I've got the question quite often, how do you put a very light color on top of a dark color when it's wet without causing it to mix in? Well, we're on the same theme here. Now, I washed all the dark color out of the brush. And first of all, you need a brush that is completely dry. And so I like to wash mine out by pushing it on the corner of my brush washer right here, rotating it in my hand and allowing the color to fall off. And I always keep a pad down below me here where I can blot it. Then I get a clean paper towel to show you here. Then I do this. You've seen me do this before if you watch many of our quick tips, probably, where I then squeeze the brush and I move it back and forth like this. That helps for that liquid to move out of the brush onto the paper towel. Now then I'll check it to be sure it's dry. You can tell by what's on my finger. If my fingers are wet, the brush is still wet. You don't want that solvent going into the paint. So always check it to be sure it's dry. Alright, I'm going to the lightest color now. I'm going to pull that lightest color, and again I'm going to load that color, there it is, so that the brush is covered. There's enough paint on that brush to go onto the canvas. Load it a little bit more. And if you'll notice when I'm loading, I'm not loading like this. I'm not using a road scrape, but I'm loading more parallel. More parallel, having the brush a little bit more parallel, a tighter angle onto the palette itself. And then if I hold that brush, what we call the belly of the brush, you hold the belly of the brush almost parallel to the canvas itself. Let me reload that, because here you go, like that. then you will have that, you'll be able to layer that white paint. Now if this happens, and this will happen, if this happens that it ends up pulling a little bit of paint off, what you do, take a paper towel, wipe that off the brush, go back into your color. I'm going to have to mix some more color in there. So just going to be sure I have, you got to have enough color on there or it doesn't work. Alright, here we go. Load that belly. Load that belly. And there you go. So you can have, I'm going to push some white in here to show you. You can have a lighter color sitting on a darker color. Where the darker color is wet by the way you control the brush. Alright, so there's your first thing. How to layer or build alla prima layers. How to layer one wet color on top of the other. Now as you get further and further into the finishing of the painting, you can put thicker and thicker layers on. But you work those layers, each layer a little bit, the first layer relatively thin without medium, and then the next layer has a little bit more paint in it, and one on top of that a little bit more paint, and then once you reach that point where you're ready to finish, you can plop big blobs of paint on just using these techniques and it will work. Alright, so there's your first one. Now the next one is creating a thin line. How do you use a flat brush without going to another brush, or how do you use you can use a filbert brush for this too, but I'm going to use the flat brush for this. How do you create a thin line? Alright, once again, start out always with a clean, dry brush. You don't want too much solvent in that, don't want any solvent in that brush at all, or else it will contaminate the paint and you will have paint going on too thin. You'll lose control. Alright, so creating that thin line, let me just use color right here. You can create this thin line either on top. I'm going to load both sides of the brushes here this time. Before I loaded one side of the brush. I could have loaded both, but this works better if you load both sides of the brush. Now look what I'm doing. I'm pulling the brush down into the paint like that on both sides, and I have a nice chisel edge on the brush. You see that chisel edge? Let me work it, put just a little bit more like that to be sure it's absolutely a chisel edge. You see that? Alright, then I use the tip, just the tip and the corner of the brush, and don't pull it too hard, and there you go. You can get, if you have just a slight angle, let me show you what I'm talking about here. And here again, each time reload, just a slight angle. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Get it a little bit closer to so that you can see. Instead of going straight down like that, you pull the brush just at a slight angle like that. Just like that. Or it could be on the other side too, a slight angle. Where you're on the tip of the brush, but you're putting most of the pressure. See if I can do this here. There we go, right there. You're on the tip of the brush, but you're putting most of the pressure on the top side. If you're coming down vertically, most of the pressure on the top side. As you pull the brush, most of the pressure should be on the side opposite. I guess you should say that in the direction you're pulling. So if you're pulling this way, that most of that pressure is right in here. If you're pulling this way, like this, most of that pressure is right here. So the pressure is not on the back side. A lot of people will do that and you see what you get. If you have that pressure on the back side of the tip of the brush, it's going to make it thicker, the line thicker. Another way I make a thin line, and by the way, you can get that line just as thin, almost as thin as the brush itself. You see, like that, by putting less pressure on the line itself. Another way I make especially when I'm making organic thin shapes like limbs on a tree or something like that. You might have seen me do this in demonstration where I use a stamping method, again having the brush at a chisel tip, and I will do something like this. Depending on where it's going, I'll stamp it, turn it slightly and stamp it again, and give it a little, as it goes into a taper, as a limb will go into a taper towards the end, just a lighter stamp, and then eventually just kind of let it taper off. That's another way you can get a thin line without having to change brushes. So practice that. That's the thin line. Now, another one that seems to perplex people is a situation like this, where you have dark color sitting on light color, but not like this. For example, let's just use, I'll just continue this. Suppose this is an area of shadow, so I'll just place that. Suppose it's an area of shadow. Paint's already there, the paint is dark, the paint is wet, an area of shadow. And beyond that shadow, you have an area of light. Now, if this were grass, we'd be using green, or we'd be using, if it were dead grass, we might be using a very low saturation of yellow. So let's just say right here, let's put a light color right here. And it does work in reverse too, so I could do it both ways. So let's just put it on both sides and show you how it works both ways. And we need more paint than that. On the lighter, on the color, if it were the darker color and then you had dark weeds or a dark pole or something just moving up over that lighter color, and then you would need more of that darker color applied. Now that might have sounded a little bit elusive, so let me see if I can explain that a little bit better. Let's get this get a little bit more of that lighter color here. Wiping off the palette knife, pulling a little bit more of the light in here. I'm going to keep that light enough to show you this little technical maneuver. But you'll find this, I don't like to say this is how you paint grasses or whatever. You might find this useful in a number of ways, and you won't know it until you see it. You can say, aha, I know how to do that. I know this little technique. So I'm going to show you both ways. I'm going to put the lighter color, I'm going to put a little bit more paint, scoop a little bit more paint onto the brush, and put a little bit more paint right here, like that. And I'll put a little bit more right up here. Now let's show you what we can do there. You can actually use the paint that you've already applied to the canvas. I'll show you two ways to do this. So if you have, suppose you have the edges of grass here and you want to know how to show that, or it could be almost anything. It's something textured. This time what you need to do is to get the brush totally dry, like this. Take all the paint out of it, totally dry, and just sort of mess it up a little bit, like that. You don't want a chisel edge for this one. Then you take the back side of those bristles, and here's what you do. You apply the back side of those bristles to the paint already there and give it a flip up. See what I'm talking about? You'll find that very useful. Let's put a little bit more paint down there in that light. It's right in here. Because you do need enough paint in the light to show that, but there might be, you might need some edges softer, and you might need some a little more distinctive. I'll put some paint there. All right, let's clean that off now, and let's get that going. And we can push that right in here, and there we go. See there? Another way you can do that is to load the brush like this, where you're not making a chisel, but I'm going to show you here first, where you're actually loading it by pushing just the bristles, letting the bristles kind of crawl a little bit like that, so that you're loading not all the bristles, but just those bristles on that back side of the brush. So you can load it like that, so those bristles on the back side, on the bristles of the back side of the brush pick up the paint, and then you lay it down just so those bristles come up. There you go, just like that. So you can do that on the back side too, where you see I already did that a little bit, where the dark pulled in. Like if you have light grasses in front of a dark shadow here, the light rays are catching onto these blades of grass that are going up. That's what you want to show. This is a wonderful technique for showing that, but you might have other things that you can show that with too. And you see, in doing that also, we might have, if we've got tall grasses in the light, we might also have tall grasses in the shadow. And then if you're going far, and you see I did that automatically, do the same thing there, where you will allow just the back side of the brush to pick up the color that's already there and push it into the other color. Now I think you will find all these are technical. There's no magic here. It's not inspiration. It's looking at a subject, analyzing what needs to happen there in the way of paint and using the brush, and then interpreting that in what you do here. That's technical. And the inspiration is part of what drives that technique. But if you don't know this, if you don't have the technique, if you don't have the technical part, then you see this wonderful something that's going on, you won't know what to do about it. So I think if you will practice these, you can build a muscle memory in the way you hold the brush and the way you maneuver the brush in order to make all three of these very special brush strokes or types of brush work for you. Be sure to view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianeMize.com where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.